All right, welcome back everyone to Black and Ritual. I hope you are having a phenomenal Tuesday. We'll be talking about the history of medicine. This is the Tuskegee study, the experiment. So let's go ahead and get into it. So we'll just be talking about the overall Tuskegee study, how it helped the public health services, and how we were the guinea pigs for this specific study. So, in a professional manner, we, helped out the public health services, but there were a lot of injustices that had occurred that many people do not know about. So the Tuskegee study was tailored towards obviously Black people in both Alabama as well as Guatemala. So this was I wouldn't say the foundation of the Tuskegee University, which is a historical Black university. But in 1932, the Public Health Services worked with the Tuskegee Institute to begin a study on natural history of syphilis in hopes of quote unquote justifying treatments program for blacks, right? Now, it was called the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in Negro Male. However, the study was intended to, well, they say to examine patterns and causes of health conditions in defined population groups in order to impact public policy and practices. Now, the Tuskegee study did not follow normal protocols, and they began to experiment. Beyond the assertion of the impact of the untreated late stage of syphilis in African American men. And this specifically lasted about 40 years. So from 1932 to 1972 was when this study, quote unquote, was enacted. So there were over 200 men, African American men from Macon County, Alabama. And many people do not even talk about what happened in Guatemala because this was the same thing as well. So this was in Macon County, Alabama. Do not let anyone confuse you. Okay, so this specifically was in Alabama. So actually, there were nearly 400 men that were assumed, right, quote unquote, to have syphilis. Often, what they had called was bad blood. And there were 200 controls. So you have a control group that were assumed to be to not have syphilis. Now, the obviously the African American men were poor, and for the most part illiterate. They didn't know, they were you know enslaved. They were from enslaved families, so they were sharecroppers from rural Macon County, Alabama. So for about 40 years, the public health services came back to Macon County for testing to follow up with the men, and promising them money, family for their families, for burial in exchange of the right to autopsy them at the death, because you know that syphilis, it kills when it's not treated, right? So this is what they did. So they already knew what the disease was. They already knew how to treat it. So that's what the making of diseases are. So anyway, so they were poor, illiterate African American men sharecroppers from rural Macon County, Alabama, recruited for the study. The United States Public Health Services Representative Talia Ferrero Clark was credited the original designer of the Tuskegee study. So, in order to make the study acceptable to blacks, in the area, he solicited to the Tuskegee Institution, which is the historical Black college in Alabama, as we know as Tuskegee University, and as an inclusion to the Arkansas Regional Public Health Services offices. So Clark initial goal, quote unquote, was to follow the untreated syphilis in groups of Black men for about 6 to 9 months, and then follow up with the treatment phase when he understood the intentions of the study other study members to extend, the study, um, and to use deceptive practices. Clark d- disagreed and retired the year after the study began. So you guys can take on, your own intuitive perception, because that's what this channel is all about at Black and Ritual. We can infer that, since him being the designer of the study, and getting ready to retire, that you know uh, you know the intentions were exactly what they were, to infect Black men with syphilis. So around the Depression era, there was flyers advocating specifically the early treatments of syphilis, and obviously it says on a flyer, it says syphilis 6 out of 10 cured because they did not wait too long. So beginning in 1932, after some initial treatments was given, uh, the government stopped funding, because of the, due to the Great Depression and things like that. So the public health services provided aspirin and iron tonics, implying through deception that these were to cure men of quote unquote bad blood, and that's what they called the people who had syphilis, bad blood. So, what had started as a treatment program quickly became into an experiment in the effect of the late stages of syphilis without treatment. And the only permission acts, so the only requirement, basically, it turned out to be a requirement for even participating in a study, was for their bodies to be used as an autopsy, in exchange, for payment of their burial, because they knew that the Black men families were not going to be able to pay to have their bodies buried. So, and this, went on for about 40 years, but, you know, um, 15 years in, the treatment, which is penicillin today, is penicillin, was already available and was never given to these men and their families. Now, there were several advertisements, as you guys know, or you guys don't know, for the bad blood, for the syphilis, for the treatment, and specifically on the flyer it says, "Colored people, do you have bad blood? Free blood tests, free treatment by county health and government doctors. Too many." Pretty much that's it was soliciting data for the experiment, for people to receive treatment. And there were no, the doctors had no intentions of curing them of syphilis. So they were recruiting people who possibly had syphilis, or maybe thought they had syphilis, right, to get these tests, to get the test done, and then they're like, okay, well, you have bad blood, so we're going to need to treat you, right? And they've done several things to these Black men during this time. So they were deliberately left to degenerate under the ravage of syphilis, which included tumors, heart disease, paralysis, blindness, insanity, and death. So one of the doctors specifically involved in a study explained, "As I see it, we have no further interest in these patients until they die." So they use humans as laboratory animals. So me, as knowing, syphilis is found in the testicles, and current studies, when they, study now, they're using a rat's testicles. That's where syphilis is found. So in the male's rat testicles. So the true nature of the experiment had been kept from, every participant who cooperated in the study, and they were sharecroppers of disadvantaged, lives, and they were easily manipulated. So this is another example of systemic racism. So as they became pawns of the study, they were encouraged to go to the doctor, to receive treatment. And this is exactly what they kind of said. They were like, last chance for for special free treatments for your syphilis. And that was promoted very widely in letters that were getting them hyped up to get, to go get this vaccine, basically, to go get this treatment. Excuse me. I don't know why I said vaccine. But the fact of the matter is that they were doing autopsies. They were preparing to do autopsies as a requirement. So with them signing these papers, signing over their quote unquote rights that we already did not have as previous slaves, you know, they eventually made it so that it is required that we give over our bodies for study. Okay. So there was a heavy price to pay in the name of the bad science. So by the end of the experiment, 28 of those men had directly died from syphilis, and 100 were dead of the related complications. 40 of their wives had been infected, and 19 of their children has been born to congenital syphilis. So um, the public health department, the public health services, United States of America Public Health Services, gave a certificate of participation in the syphilis study to everyone who participated in the study for over 25 years. And this was awarded in 1958. The public health leaders employed many strategies to keep the subjects happy, quote unquote, with their involvement, and this could, possibly bring on autopsy that they can eventually use to build their medical research. So this specific uh, uh, certificate was given for the involvement in the Tuskegee medical research study. So the specific incentives that they perhaps were deceived to receive was free medical examinations, free rides to and from a clinic, hot meals on examination days, free treatment for minor ailments, payment of burial stipends to survivors. So these were the things in which we should already have access to as normal human beings. Maybe not necessarily the rides to and fro the clinic, but however, we should already have these things available to us and accessible to us. But as Black men, Black people of color, we did not have access to that, especially during the Great Depression. So the Tuskegee Institute participated in the study. So Dr. Eugene Dibble, as well as nurse Eunice Rivers, were encouraged to get participants to participate in the study. However, they were not clearly informed of the deceptive methodology used in a study protocol. So Robert Moulton, the head of the Tuskegee study at the time, gave credibility to the study with his endorsement and institutional resources to govern the study. So there were alternative choices available to the U.S. Public Health Services. During the study, the U.S. Public Health Services sought on several occasions to ensure that the subjects did not receive treatment. Okay. To this end, the doctors met with the groups of local Black doctors to ask their cooperation in not treating the men. Lists of subjects were distributed to Macon County physicians with the letters requesting them to refer these men back to the USPHS if they sought care. Okay, so available choices of doctors was to treat all syphilis subjects and closing the study, splitting off a control group for testing with penicillin. Instead, the Tuskegee scientists continued to study without treating any participants and withholding penicillin and information about it from the patients. So the public health doctors and scientists just prevented them from receiving available treatment. So, they began to continually take on blood samples, because your blood is is everything in your body. Your blood includes every cell, all your cells. Excuse me, all of your blood includes several cells that that I'm gonna just say this. I don't want to go all in depth into it, but your blood includes cells, which houses your DNA. And once they have your DNA, they only need one vial. Okay, so it's one vial is only needed to perform many tests, certain tests. So there were more than a dozen reports of the Tuskegee study in the major medical journals, and medical schools, sought this information, taught this information, and also sought certain information, because there were volunteers. The term volunteer was used in several reports, as if the men knew that they were getting into, rather being deceived. Okay. So the U.S. Public Health Services defended the ethics of the study. So in 1972, John Heller, which is a medical doctor representing the Public Health Services, later in the years led the national division to defend the ethics of the study, stating that the study, the longer the study was, the better the ultimate information would we would derive. So the more information they will be able to get, which was very much true, because people were oblivious to the men being infected with syphilis. So Heller's leadership coincided with the years of when the penicillin was introduced as routine treatment. So he was just trying to cover, people trying to receive treatment, or doctors trying to help and give the actual treatment that was already available for syphilis, but in fact was deterring everyone to not do so. So, yeah. So, four comments were made by doctors who were a part of the study. And Dr. Clark said this state of affairs is due to scarcity of doctors rather than low intelligence of Negro population, depressed economic conditions, and very common promiscuous sexual relations of this population group. As I see it, we have no longer further interest in these patients until they die. That was Dr. OC. And then Dr. Van Vonderler said to Clark is that it is my desire to keep the main purpose of the work from the Negroes in the county and to continue their interest in treatments. Unless the law winks occasionally, you have no progress in medicine. John Cutler. So the news reporter of the New York Times said that pretty much, you know, we're going to publish this information because the climate of race relations had to change drastically in America, and it just wasn't right. So basically, they published it. Between 1965 to 1972, over 2/3 of the original participants were deceased, and the other 200 were difficult to locate. The climate of the race relations had to change drastically in America, and many of the participants involved in the study were beginning to re-examine the morality of the study. Even with these differences and difficulties, the study continued on until the summer of 1972. So some of us know people who were born in 1972. This was not that long ago, right? So when the story was revealed nationwide, in the Washington Star Press, it drew a lot of attention. So the Tuskegee study, this was more about, the CDC. So in 1972, the CDC ended the study. The study was barely ended in 1972. Okay. So the remaining subjects each received minimal financial settlements after the lawsuit. So interesting. While the public was not aware of the alleged research committed on Macon County, the scientific community, especially some of those studying venereal diseases and social epidemiology, were quite aware of the true nature of the study. So, the doctors were drawn away from helping out. The subjects in the study were coordinated, and the doctors injects the test, the subjects with the syphilis. So the main things to take away from this: what happened? Why? Not why, but what happened? What rights were violated to these Black men? What unethical behaviors were done to these Black men? The U.S. Constitution, the government's, U.S. Constitution, their rights were completely violated. And they were citizens. They were brought on slave boats here. We were citizens, okay? So we helped build this country. So the government knew the participants had syphilis and failed to treat them. The participants had to agree to an autopsy after their death in order to have their funeral costs covered for their families. So they already foreknew how bad this disease was going to affect these Black men. The public health services failed to fully disclose the participants that they had syphilis and were participating in the study, that the treatment was available to them. The study became very unethical from the beginning. I'm not even gonna say 1940. From the beginning, when penicillin became the recommended drug of treatment. So the golden standard was penicillin. The golden standard here today for syphilis is penicillin, okay? The public health services led participants to believe that they were being properly treated for whatever disease they had, and when in fact they were not being meaningfully treated. The public health services failed to obtain participants' written informed consents to be a part of the study. The study was racially motivated and discriminated against African Americans, in that no whites were selected to participate in this study. Researchers used misleading advertising for participants with the slogan "Last Chance for Special Free Treatment." The subjects, the Black men, were not given a treatment. Instead, they were recruited for a very risky spinal tap diagnostic. There were no rules and regulations governing the study. Now, this is the Alabama State Board of Health and Public Health Services that cooperated with the study. This is their letter. This is the consent form. This is what was said, and you guys can pause the video and look over that if you like. So, how do you guys think this impacted these families' lives? Maybe someone is watching this. Maybe it impacted their family life, right? Maybe you guys have, somebody, one of your ancestors or something. As the truth emerged about what happened during the four decades in the Tuskegee study experiment, we have learned about what happened when scientific ends take precedence over basic human rights. The men in the Tuskegee study were treated not as anonymous human beings deserving respect and dignity, but as means to an end. Recruitment in a study with half-truths and euphemism, they were kept there with outright lies and denied simple, affordable treatment because their lives and their sex partners were deemed expendable. These men has been subject to countless academic studies, news articles. Black men and women. They were always racially discriminated against, racially institutionalized, and forced into such studies. So if you guys want to read more about that, you guys can read that. Okay. So there was the attorney, the black attorney, Fred David Gray, civil rights activist, attorney, and preacher practicing law in Alabama, served as the president of the National Bar Association in 1985. He was elected the first African American president of the Alabama State Bar in 2001. He was able to help, and this is, you guys can look up the specific document. He filed him along with Rosa Parks. Not along with Rosa Parks. He defended specifically Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, to file the lawsuit, which is the Pollard versus United States of America, that provided 10,000 settlements for the Tuskegee study for the men and their families. So thank you. In honor to them, moment of silence. So in 1997, there was an quote unquote official apology. So President Clinton said the United States government did something that was wrong, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. It was an outrage to our commitment to integrity and equality, not equity, but equality for all of our citizens, and I am sorry. So this was in May 16, 1997. So African Americans just simply do not trust the medical institution then and today. And this is one of the presenting reasons why we do not trust the medical profession. Okay. So the Tuskegee study continues to cast its long shadow of contemporary relationship between African Americans and the biomedical community. Numerous reports have argued the Tuskegee study is the most important reason why many African Americans distrust the institution of medicine and public health. So the Office for Human Research Protection, after the study, they began to implement practices to prevent the repeat of the mistakes occurred in the Tuskegee study. But I like to say the exposure of what happened in the Tuskegee study. The Tuskegee study has brought the intersection of race and science to the forefront of the public health perceptions of scientific research. After the study and its consequences became front page news, it was ended in a day. So they, once it became public, they were like, oh, we gotta have to cut this out. So all of the research conducted and supported by the Department of Public Health and Human Services, requiring registering an institutional review board and obtaining federal-wide assurance. So this is what changed. This is what they began to put at place for current studies. So an institution must have the federal-wide assurance in order to receive the support from the Health and Human Services departments involving human subjects. So each federal-wide assurance must be designated to at least one pretty much review board, institutional review board registered with the Office of Human Research Protections. And before obtaining the federal-wide assurance, an institution must either register its own internal or external review board after establishing a written agreement with with the other organizations. So an institutional review board is a committee that performs ethical review of the proposed research. So, other federal departments and agencies that conduct and support human subjects research permits the use of the federal-wide assurance as insurance requiring by their regulations. So, this is the current foundation of research. Community participation helped the study achieve its purpose. So, obviously, levels of community participatory research, community notification, endorsement, advice, consent. These must be set in place before, um, people are able to, perform these studies on certain communities. Now, there are certain communities that were involved, specifically church and businesses were notified, as, oh, we have this, treatment for Tuskegee, for syphilis, and constantly, endorsing, other businesses and nurses to, you know, as the forefront of, like, they are representatives of the community, and that's the main thing of public health today. You have to, in order to have a oriented um, community oriented service, you have to reach out to the representatives of that community. You have to. So here's the resources. Feel free to pause and take a look and get what you guys need out of this.